Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that this game is almost 10 years old, and I did debate whether this should be a retro review or a re-review. I decided to make it a re-review for a couple of reasons. The first is because I've already done re-reviews for the New Order and the New Colossus, so it just made sense to cover the Old Blood in the same format. The other reason is the Old Blood isn't a full-length game like those other two, and if I was going to go back and do a retro review and look at things like the development history, I think it would be less interesting than covering either of those games in that way. Anyway, those are my reasons for not doing a retro review. You can choose to agree with them, or you can be wrong. So, Wolfenstein the Old Blood is a prequel to 2014's Wolfenstein the New Order, and was once again developed by Machine Games. It was originally planned as two separate DLC packs, which were instead merged together into a standalone game. Unlike the New Order, the Old Blood wasn't a cross-gen title, so while it uses the same engine, the development team were able to push the tech harder and do things not possible in the previous title. That also means, like the previous game, it uses dynamic resolution scaling and should benefit from being run on more powerful hardware. With GPUs having a lot more headroom, I assumed a locked 60 frames per second at 1080p should be possible on the PS5, but I wondered if there would be any other benefits of playing it nearly 10 years after its original launch. I was also curious to see how the gameplay held up. The New Order was originally praised for being a throwback to classic FPS gameplay mechanics, and with boomer shooters seeing a lot more love right now, it seemed like an ideal time to go back and tackle something that's been sitting in my backlog for ages. I think a lot of people, myself included, were confused about what this game was back when it came out. Is it DLC? Do you need to own a copy of the New Order to play it? And if it's a prequel, should you play it before playing the New Order? It turns out the answer to all of these questions is no. It started out as DLC, but it was decided, for reasons known only to Todd, that rather than release two separate expansions, that they would be combined into the one package. Also, for reasons known only to the wearer of the beige jacket, it got a physical release, but only in the EU, Australia and New Zealand. So no, you don't need to own a copy of the New Order to play this. You also don't need to play it first. While it is set in the same universe as the rest of Machine Games' Wolfenstein games, there aren't any plot lines that directly link into the New Order. It's very much a standalone experience. Think of it as being what Rogue One is to the original Star Wars trilogy, so playing it after the New Order is fine. The game is split into two separate halves that can be thought of as chapters. The first half sees Blazkowicz infiltrating Castle Wolfenstein to steal a document that contains the location of Death's Head. This half of the game is reasonably tame in its story compared to other Wolfenstein titles. The second chapter picks up directly after the end of the first and has you travel to the nearby village of Wolfberg. This half of the game mixes things up from a gameplay and story perspective. It's tonally very different, exploring occult themes and adding in zombies. It has many more scenarios with multiple paths too, allowing you to approach missions in a number of ways, which adds a ton of replay value. Unsurprisingly, it's a short game compared to the mainline entries. According to How Long to Beat, the average playthrough is about 6 hours, but it can be almost 9 if you want to do everything. Changing the difficulty can also have a big impact on pacing. On I Am Death Incarnate, for example, the game is much slower paced. At least it was for me on my first playthrough. I don't think playing it on the harder settings is essential though, especially if you prefer combat over stealth. This has just become my go-to in recent years because I like a challenge. I actually found a few of the chapters kind of frustrating, so you may want to reserve the higher difficulties for subsequent playthroughs. My playthrough clocked in at just over 8 hours, and this included many attempts of certain stages. There's a bit where you have to sneak around and power down these tank enemies, for example, and god damn did I struggle here. Regardless of the setting you choose, there are still plenty of moments where combat is your only choice, but the rest of the game allows you to choose between guns blazing or stealth. If you do decide the combat path, be prepared to take on about 10 times the amount of enemies. I didn't like stealth much in the New Order, but there are more branching paths and areas that feel conducive for sneaking here. Plus, stealth takedowns with a new pipe weapon are pretty damn satisfying. Because the Old Blood didn't come out for the PS3 or 360, the development team were able to increase the scope of the game. Levels are bigger, with more detail, and they often contain more enemies. It's still quite linear, it's just that now you have a bit more agency, and areas feel less video gamey in their layout. This feeds into the core game design concept of player choice, where you're free to tackle each scenario however you want. The controls have Machine Games' trademark buttery smooth responsiveness, and movement in general feels great. There's a couple of new mechanics like the run into slide. There's also a few new enemy types like a sniper, a heavy soldier with a shotgun, a couple of new tank variants, and these drone thingos. As good as the movement, stealth and gunplay is, I was a bit disappointed with the boss fights. The series is known for its epic and over-the-top boss battles, and although there are a couple of larger enemies to fight, there's only one boss that is properly huge. The other issue is the overuse of letters and notes to tell the story. In a game so laser-focused on action, these feel like an inconvenience to stop and read. You can totally skip them and get the gist of what's happening from the occasional cutscene, although it would have been better if this content could have been more creatively presented. Back in 2019, I thought The New Order was a good-looking game, albeit with a few issues, such as some weird lighting effects and low-res textures. Sadly, the low-res textures remain, probably because it reuses assets from The New Order, but the lighting seems to have been fixed. The art direction and use of lighting is again a high point and contributes to the overall atmosphere. The level design is fantastic too. Machine games have always been a dab hand at environmental storytelling, and The Old Blood is no exception. Every space is full of interesting objects and details to explore that make Castle Wolfenstein and Wolfberg feel like tangible places. If you're a fan of the franchise or id games in general, there are heaps of Easter eggs to find too. There's also a bunch of these optional retro sections, which I gotta admit got boring pretty fast. Even almost 10 years on, there are parts of the presentation that look like they could have been lifted from a game that released this year. Take this NPC for example. He has no business looking this good. I mean, compare this to the NPCs in Cyberpunk. Do they have visible sweat running down their heads? I know that I keep dunking on Cyberpunk and basically the only reason I still own a copy is to drag it out each year for a beating, but come on. This was a game that many people had on their best looking games of 2023 lists. Mick Gordon once again did the music, and before you get too excited, it's more of a theatrical score. It's fine, I guess, but it never hits as hard as either The New Order or New Colossus. Maybe that's why I enjoyed stealthing more in this one, because you don't get the same pounding guitar riffs every time the action picks up. Something that hasn't changed, unfortunately, are the jaggies and shimmering edges. I don't remember The New Order suffering from this quite as badly, but maybe that's just my old age kicking in. If you're on PC, there are mods that let you improve the visuals, but on console, it's an occasional reminder of how old this game is. Now, normally in these re-reviews, I talk about how the game has evolved since launch. Usually, games receive various updates throughout their life cycles that improve performance, fix bugs, and add new content. It's become pretty commonplace for games to release in broken, unplayable states that take months or even years to fix. That's why I do these re-reviews. The point I'm making here is that The Old Blood is a complete opposite of this. Outside of one or two minor patches that addressed bugs, it's basically the same game that launched 9 years ago. And I think this speaks volumes for how solid and complete it is. Yeah, I know it's not a full-length game, and it has no online component, but I still think machine games deserve credit. It does unfortunately mean that if you played it back at launch and were hoping that over time it had been improved in some way, you're out of luck. This makes some of its design feel antiquated. The complete lack of accessibility options is one example that stands out. Seeing as it was originally intended to be DLC itself, it makes sense that it never got any DLC of its own. So for better or worse, The Old Blood in 2024 plays almost exactly the same as it did in 2015. What's with the almost? Well, that's what I want to talk about now. Just because the game hasn't changed doesn't mean that the hardware that can play it hasn't. I mentioned earlier that The Old Blood uses dynamic resolution scaling to preserve the 60 frames per second gameplay, so playing it on a new PC, Xbox Series machine, or a PS5 should provide a boost to performance and therefore the visual presentation. On the PS5, the load times are almost non-existent. I'm playing off a disc too, so installing on an SSD would be even better. This is a small but welcome improvement that's definitely felt when playing on the harder settings. Mega Textures had a few streaming issues on last gen, but I never noticed any laggy assets here. I mean, they aren't exactly El Primo resolution textures, still, the presentation is incredibly seamless. The bottom line is that although it never got a next-gen update, because of how it was designed, current systems are able to play it at the top of both its graphical and performance caps.
This place is infested with Nazi pigs. You should be careful. Do not kill anyone unless you have to.
What's that? Kill as many Nazis as I can?
No, I said...
Can't hear you, Kessler. Lots of static.
I don't know if it's because enough time has passed since I last played a Wolfenstein game, but I thought the Old Blood was a fucking blast. It's not as comprehensive as the mainline entries, but the action is excellent, and because of the level and mission design, repeat playthroughs are likely to be different, giving it a ton of replay value. This wasn't really a surprise, I kind of knew it would be good, but I didn't expect it to hold up as well as it does. If you played the other games and not this, or you're looking for a good place to dip your toes into the series, I would strongly recommend giving this a spin.